This is Roots, Radicals and Rockers, How Skiffle Changed the World, written by Bragg and published in 2017. A friend of mine lent me this book. He said, I think you'll enjoy it. And when I looked at it, I thought, well, I'm interested in skiffle a bit. It is part of my history, my childhood. But I'm not enough sure if I'm interested in 400 pages worth of it. So I thought, well, I'll skim read it. But in the end, I ended up reading every word, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's, it is, as it says on the tin, or as it implies, it's a history of skiffle, British skiffle. So it tells the story of that musical genre and its brief history, really. It came to the fore in the mid-1960s and it was gone again, really, after 1957. It didn't last long. But the interesting thing, particularly when you get to the final chapters, is just how many people who went on to have big careers in popular music played in skiffle bands as teenagers with their mates when they were kids at school. So we all know about the Beatles, but also less likely characters like Van Morrison and people who went on to be kind of cool or sophisticated rock aristocracy. Actually, they were all scraping away in their front rooms or garages on very primitive instruments. So Bragg tells the story of how this all came about. He starts with an opening chapter about Huddie Ledbelly, who's a black American a musician who spent quite a bit of time in prison, and how he wrote Rock Island Line and other songs later, like Midnight Special and whatever. And these kind of bluesy songs, rocky kind of bluesy songs, were picked up by young Brits early on. But also, as well as that kind of tradition of music, there was also kind of New Orleans jazz, which was coming across the Atlantic, but mainly by being brought by merchant seaman Ken Collier, who was a jazz musician who was so devoted to jazz and knew that there was music being made in New Orleans. It was very hard to get hold of music in those days, and records, you were few and far between in some kind of areas. And this guy, Ken Collier, was so keen on this music that he enlisted as a merchant seaman, hoping to get a passage. He was a cook on a ship, hoping to get passage to New Orleans. But I think instead he got sent off to Australia and what have you. But he persevered and eventually did get to New Orleans, and he went ashore there and stayed ashore until he was deported. But by that time he'd soaked himself in the kind of jazz music that was being created in New Orleans at the time, and he brought all that back to England. He was a difficult man by all accounts, but he was playing in a band. And so Bragg tells the story of how all this came about. The Chris Barber Jazz Band was also very important in terms of the development of skiffle. He had a guitarist in his band called Lonnie Donegan, and the interesting thing was, in those days, the guitarist used to stand at the back of the band. They were a kind of rhythm instrument along with the drums that stayed at the back. They weren't at the forefront, and yet, of course, when rock and roll groups started, the guitars were very much to the fore with Elvis Presley and what have you. So Chris Barber's jazz band was getting gigs and getting played, and they used to have a section in the middle when people like Lonnie Donegan and other members of the band used to do a short skiffle set, and then they'd go back to the full band on the jazz. So it started off in there. So, okay, if you're not that interested in skiffle, why might you read this book? Well, it's a brilliant evocation of Britain in the 1950s. I know that topic's been done many times, but Bragg has done a good job in recreating the culture of the times, just how boring kind of austerity was post-war, and just how revolutionary this noisy music was. But it brilliantly evokes that period when I was a kid. It made it all come back to me really in terms of Bragg's writing. So the austerity of boring 1950s Britain did make for a very fertile ground in which new art forms could and did evolve through the 1960s. And the reason why skiffle, rather than other forms of music, became so popular so fast was also due to the fact that it was very simple to perform. The instruments were simple, so you didn't need much money. A cheap guitar was the most sophisticated of the instruments, and you could get by on playing 3 chords, so you didn't need great musical knowledge or skill. The other standard instrument was a washboard, available in those days in most homes, and also a tea-chest bass, a tea-chest and a broom handle, and a one string made out of rope. And those 3 instruments, plus somebody who could sing, or at least sing a bit, and these songs were fairly easy to perform, and you were away, and you could have a skiffle band. And there were skiffle competitions, skiffle magazines, big news. Once the music press had got over its rather sniffy attitude towards this crude music, it really took off. It became rebellious music, so it was people were playing skiffle on the first Aldermaston marches, the CND marches. But also people like Lonnie Donegan, who had massive fame through skiffle, morphed into kind of rather embarrassing family entertainers singing My Old Man's a Dustman on the television and what have you. And Bragg's very good because he jumps forward a decade or so to the birth of punk, and he makes all the comparisons between skiffle and punk. Simple instruments, simple 3-chord arrangements, anybody could do it. It had energy and rebelliousness about it, and I thought it was very, very interesting the way he talked about the same kind of forces creating punk. And it made me reflect that I play in a couple of ukulele groups now with a lot of people who were, many of whom were my age, so would have been around as kids in the skiffle period. We would have been sensible adults during punk, and now in older years are playing ukuleles. And that's again music that only requires a few chords. You don't need much musicianship. It's done more communally, so people are doing it in a very amateurish but very, very enjoyable way. But I suppose what really kind of struck home to me was the guy who leads our ukulele group, our good friend Rob. He is not only an ex-skiffler, he still plays in a skiffle band with his brother and sister, and he still plays a tea-chest bass. So there's a real kind of history going through, 60 years, more than 60 years now, of British folk culture, if you like, that's never been quite mainstream, but it's very, very popular. And I think Bragg kind of just, he evokes all that kind of movement and enthusiasm. So I would recommend this book, and even if you don't think you like skiffle that much, I think it's fabulous in lots of other ways that I've tried to describe. Okay.